So where we started, I think the conversation we just heard discussed pretty well what we were aiming for, what we were interested in. I'm a hardware guy. Alexander's a game dev guy. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the ideas we had, the inspirations that brought us there, and then Alexander will talk about where we ended up. So initially, this kind of stuff's fun, but obviously not really the kind of hardware we could run up in a couple of months. So we started thinking about analog controls. We don't see them so much anymore. They kind of fade into the background, but they've got really fun features, like they click. So we were looking around for inspiration. Where do you find analog controls? Old sci-fi, pretty great trove of inspiration for this stuff. 2001, one of the best for inspiration. It's not a great movie, I don't think. Also, lots of military and industrial stuff has super interesting control panels. This is a submarine destroyer. Lots of great stuff on there. Also interesting, all the labels are kind of just stuck on afterwards. We like that idea that we could kind of throw some stuff on at the end and it would look deliberate. Old school phone systems, we actually ended up kind of fixated on this idea of patch cables that you actually use to physically patch one thing to another thing. You'll see that in the final prototype. Audio synthesizers, another great source of inspiration. This one's kind of iPod meets Star Trek via Denmark, I think. Something more old-fashioned, but definitely interesting to us, again with the patch cables. And the dials, lots of dials. So okay, lots of inspiration. What were we actually gonna build? So we decided to go for a fairly simple game genre, kind of a Space Invaders type of a game, and then to make it completely physically controlled with an analog control panel. So we drew some colored lines, cut some plywood, lasered some plastic, wrote some code, drew some graphics, soldered some electronics, and then we got this, which Alexander will talk about.
All right, I sure will. So we ended up with the game. You saw a screenshot of the game earlier. This is a screenshot of the actual control panel, which looks awesome. What am I talking about? The game. All right, so I guess I'll just briefly go over the game. In the game, you're controlling a spaceship using, instead of a keyboard or controller where all the buttons are kind of like, push us because we're going to be friendly to you and do things, we made a console where, and we didn't exactly want to be friendly because we wanted you to be, or you, I guess you're all the players. We wanted the player to be involved with the hardware at the same level they're involved with the software. So rather than most games where the challenge is all inside the game, here the challenge is kind of distributed evenly between the game and the hardware. And I think we struck a good balance. I guess that's it. You should ask questions.
I guess we're up then, aren't we?
Yes.
Indeed.
I try not to think of myself as too old, but I just learned that analog is retro, and that there was a time that for some of you that you might not have known, there's a time before the iPhone, where people, when they press buttons, things went click. So that's one thing I love about this concept, is this sort of return to that patch bay, turn a dial, affect something inside that gaming space and world. How did you two navigate that kind of conversation about that as a hardware gamer? I mean, you've shown us some of the inspiration, but was it a challenge to find a dialogue between the two of you on that space?
I don't think it was. We had a lot of the inspiration we both shared with each other ended up being mutually interesting. And kind of from the start, we both knew that we wanted to go in the more physical direction of hardware controls, because recently there's been a big trend of like touch screens and wishy-washy motion controls. Anything to say about that?
Yeah, pretty much that. I mean, I think we very much started from the hardware. Luckily not to the detriment of the project, but like we were really obsessed with the hardware, and then it was about, okay, what game can we do that makes this make sense. But you can play it afterwards. It will be a lot easier than me describing it.
There are lasers.
Well, actually, I'd like the answer to that question too, because even though there are lasers, and I know Defender from way back, I'm struck by your comment about how you wanted the hardware interface to not exactly be easy, because one of the things about the hardware interface is that it's an instrument. Even if it's got that wonderful tangibility, and I love that about it too, for most of those kind of interfaces that you showed as inspiration, what you really wanted the person to do was not think about the hardware. You wanted them to think about what the hardware was doing, right? So in a sub-destroyer, if somebody gets obsessed with the click of the switch, the sub doesn't get destroyed. And that's a bad thing in military terms. I like what you've built, and it seems like, in a way, it kind of defies what you said, because it looks to me like it actually would be easy to use as an instrument and satisfying to use. I'm curious to know, with the controls, do they offer any kind of feedback to the person as to what they did, or is it all tangible input and then visible output?
Yeah. So there are kind of two levels to how you understand the game. There's this photo, and perhaps this is Freudian, doesn't actually include the bigger game, although it did exist when we took this photo. So what you're seeing on the screen within the console is kind of feedback that gives you some sense of, I just did a thing with a switch, or I patched a thing into a thing. Like, does that mean anything? Does it seem good? Does it seem bad? And then you can kind of put these little steps together. They're fairly simple, small steps that you put together into a chain, and then you actually kind of send that into the game world. That's the idea. So it borrows a lot from the audio synthesizer world in that way. You're kind of seeing what happens if you plug this into this and that into that and turn that to number 7, and experimenting with that idea. So
it's a configure and execute kind of thing then?
Yeah, and I guess I didn't want to say, like, it's not trying to get in your way, but we want to just, it's like kind of pulling the heads-up display that's in most games out into the hardware, rather than putting all your attention on the screen. You can take time to enjoy the clicking of the buttons and the dials and stuff.
Thanks.
Well, it sounds like a great interface, and we'll have a chance to explore it in greater detail in a short while. But because we are quite limited on time, I'm going to say thank you to Patrick and Alex, and get our next team.